This is the AP European History Midterm Review. I'm just going to go through these questions, give you a discussion on what I think the answers are, and hopefully this will help you do excellent on the AP European History Midterm. So let's have fun. The Renaissance, Chapter 12. What were the pillars of the Renaissance? Two of them. In my mind, they are humanism and secularism. So what was scholasticism? The basic curriculum of universities before the Renaissance was scholasticism. It's very logic-based rather than observation and experimentation-based. It's rooted in Aristotle. It's vocational-based. And the only three majors that you have, if you want to call them a major, are law, theology, and medicine. And it's conducted in Latin, and the Latin was very substandard. So what was humanism, and what are the essential elements of humanism? Humanism is the idea that human characteristics, human individuality, human history, human expression, human emotion, human accomplishments, human potential, human happiness are all worth studying. During the Middle Ages, people didn't see humans and their affairs as being of value. God was who was worth studying. The medieval mind would say, why study lowly, insignificant, little, sinful humans when you can spend that same time and effort contemplating a holy and righteous, fearsome, but also gracious and merciful God? So humanism is also an educational curriculum, and it is a reaction to scholasticism. It's broader, it's more flexible, it's more universal, and the three essential elements of humanism are: number one, eloquence and precision of expression; number two, secularism, the idea that things outside the church and outside God and outside faith are worth studying; and number three, the classics. The ancient Greeks and Romans created art and literature and culture that reflected humanism in them, although they didn't know it at that time. And so everything that humanism touches will be touched with these three essential elements: civics, art, literature, culture, the pursuit of knowledge of all kinds. So who was this Giovanni Pico della Mirandola? What did he write, and what did he argue? He was a humanist philosopher who wrote Oration on the Dignity of Man, and in this piece, Pico expressed the essence of humanism so eloquently and so precisely. Did you see what I did there? See eloquence and precision of expression? That Oration on the Dignity of Man has been called the Renaissance Manifesto. In this piece, Pico argued that man had a unique place among all living creatures. Humans have the ability and the choice to be anything that he or she wants to be, to reach any level that he or she wants. We can ascend to being just below the angels, or we can descend down to the level of the beasts. But it's our choice, and that's a very powerful message. So speculate on what development human ideas might have led to. For example, people could express their individual accomplishments and their individual potential with, for example, discoveries of other lands, and with conquest and expansion. A secular interest in the physical universe might have led to the scientific revolution. The value of human happiness and human social improvement, as well as the call for a better education and better reading sources, might have led to the scientific revolution. So what was the difference between the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance? And basically, the Italians tended to be more secular, more individualistic, concerned with improving the individual, and those were the Italian humanists. But the Renaissance in Northern Europe had a different kind of emphasis. The Christian humanists, such as Thomas More and Erasmus, were far more religious and far more social. That is not to say that the Italian Renaissance was 100% secular and 100% individual. And that's certainly not to say that the that the Northern Renaissance was 100% religious and 100% social. There was a mix, but it's a matter of emphasis. So, what were their goals? The Christian humanists of the Northern Renaissance, and remember that the Christian humanist and Northern Renaissance both refer to essentially the same thing. They had in mind two primary applications of all of this Renaissance culture and Renaissance learning. And number one was to improve people's spiritual lives, and number two, to improve or even reform the church, to help provide both spiritual and intellectual comfort to people. So, who were the two pillars of the Northern Renaissance, and what did they do? The two pillars of the Northern Renaissance were, the two people that you should think of when you think of the Northern Renaissance are Sir Thomas More and Desiderius Erasmus. Thomas More wrote Utopia, and that was a look at a fictional society that had achieved social harmony through a more biblical application of Christian principles. And it gave people who read it a vivid, specific, concrete vision of what a perfect Christian society might look like. Erasmus wrote In Praise of Folly, in which he poked fun at the cultural and the religious practices that made no sense or were hypocritical. And he also wrote the first translation of the New Testament into Latin from the original Greek in 1,000 years. And he discovered mistakes, actually, even in the original Greek, which he corrected, and he explored all kinds of different ways to express the original document and what they were saying. And in doing this, Erasmus showed that everything, right down to the Bible itself, could be questioned. And so, what is another term applied to the Northern Renaissance? Well, we can also call that Christian humanism. Speculate on what movement the Northern Renaissance might have led to. All right, so here's the case I'm going to make. It led directly to the Protestant Reformation, in particular, with regard to its emphasis on religious reform for the improvement of society, like you see with Sir Thomas More's Utopia or Erasmus in Praise of Folly. It led to the Protestant Reformation with its humanist emphasis on applying updated scholarly methods to ancient biblical texts like Erasmus' New Latin New Testament, and its humanistic emphasis on the individual's spiritual development and experience through religious education and through direct access to the Bible, facilitated by the printing press, which, because of the affordability that it gave to books, created a wider market for works in the vernacular. What was one of the first things that Martin Luther did after he launched the Protestant Reformation? He took Erasmus's new Greek Latin New Testament and he created a German translation, because the Bible becomes more accessible to the individual when he or she can not just afford it, but read it in his or her own language. So, the Protestant Reformation. Who was Martin Luther? What did he do? Martin Luther was a priest and a doctor of theology. He was a lecturer at the University of Wittenberg, really throughout almost his entire career. He suffered from serious doubts and insecurities about his own personal salvation, and this led him to do a thorough scholarly study of what the New Testament had to say about this very issue. He identified, at least to his own satisfaction, numerous passages in the New Testament that seem to indicate that the only way to salvation and to heaven was by faith in Jesus and his sacrifice. Salvation was not something that you could buy or earn or work for with good deeds or luck your way into. When the Catholic Church ran basically a marketing campaign through his area to sell indulgences, Luther had a lot of issues with it that were very similar to the ones that Jan Hus had brought up in his home country of Bohemia 100 years before. Luther compiled these issues into a list of 95 grievances the 95 Theses, and as was custom, he nailed these to the door of the Wittenberg Church in the year 1517. Thanks in no small way to the printing press, these 95 Theses ignited a firestorm of long pent-up frustration with the way that the Catholic Church was doing things and teaching things. And Luther got into a lot of trouble. The Catholic Pope excommunicated him. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V declared Martin Luther an outlaw for refusing to recant at the Diet of Worms, which was the meeting of a large council called the Diet, whose purpose was to advise Charles V. However, many members of the nobility found Luther's message so appealing, like a breath of fresh air, that they defied the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and they gave Luther safe haven so that he could create a German translation of the New Testament and even form his new Protestant church, Lutheranism, named after Luther. So the next question, in what ways did the Protestant Reformation get out of Luther's control? Well, numerous consequences followed that Luther did not anticipate and could not stop. Number one, there was a massive German peasants' revolt which stood up against the abuses of their noble lords and used Luther's name to do it. Luther did not support the revolt, and he wrote with great passion about these rebels. Number two, Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin took Protestant doctrines a lot further than Luther had wanted to go, with such beliefs as no priesthood and predestination. Number three, deadly destructive wars of religion in the Holy Roman Empire with the Schmalkaldic League and a Swiss Civil War which actually killed Ulrich Zwingli, French wars of religion that killed 3 million people, and the 30 Years' War which killed 8 million people. Number four, Luther did not anticipate the splintering of Protestantism into countless churches, sects, and fellowships. And number five, Luther never thought that the King of England would break away from the Catholic Church over the issue of divorce and form his own Church of England with himself as the head. And number six, Martin Luther probably never counted on an English civil war which killed almost 200,000 people and which involved Cromwell's conquest of Ireland, which killed another 618,000 people, 40% of Ireland's population, and all of which ultimately ended with a glorious revolution, an English Bill of Rights, a constitutional monarchy. So the lesson would be careful what you wish for. So the Anabaptists, who were the Anabaptists? What did they stand for? And what happened to them? The Anabaptists are kind of like your quintessential example of what can go wrong with anything like a Protestant Reformation. And this is the downside of an otherwise perfectly good and fine religious doctrine that says that believers should have the freedom to read and understand Scripture for themselves. You're going to have a few people who come away with unacceptably radical views like the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists were just such a radical Protestant group. They believed, number one, that baptism was essential for salvation. Number two, and here's the kicker, a person's baptism is not valid. In other words, it has no power to save him or her unless you understand what it's for and what is happening at the time that you're baptized. In other words, you have to have a somewhat developed theology on baptism, or that baptism won't take. So number three, therefore, anybody who was baptized as an infant is not saved. And then to add to the urgency of the matter, they also believed that the end of the world was imminent. So you better get yourself straightened out and fast. And you can imagine how disturbing this might be to just about every other Christian in Europe, Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, you name it, who was baptized as an infant. The Anabaptists started collecting in a large German city called Munster, and leaders put out the call to Anabaptists from all around that they were going to make Munster their new Jerusalem. And when enough of them had come into the city, the leaders actually got themselves put on the town council and took over governance of the town and basically made it their own sovereign commune. And this was known as the Anabaptist Munster Insurrection. They kicked many of the Lutherans who had been living in the city out, including the local bishop. And Catholics and Lutherans actually cooperated together to besiege the city in a year-long siege. One of the Anabaptist leaders, a John of Leyden, built a cult of personality around himself, claiming to receive visions, claiming to be the successor of David. This was the New Jerusalem, wearing royal clothes, going around the city in elaborate processions. And he made rebaptism compulsory in the city and made polygamy compulsory in the city. And he led by example with 16 wives. Eventually, the Catholics and the Lutherans took the by now starving city of Munster back. They tortured and executed the Anabaptist leaders, and they hung their bones up in cages that hung from the local cathedral as an example for all to see if you attempt to do what the Anabaptists had done. But all of this brings up a more basic issue. One of the problems that people had with the sacraments like baptism as channels of grace and salvation is that they're too nebulous, they're too complicated. You can see in this controversy a great deal of confusion, doubt, and frustration and discouragement for the layperson who's getting conflicting messages about this very important sacrament from these various groups like the Catholic Church, the Lutherans, the Anabaptists, and they're just trying to get it right. And they're wondering why all of this has to be so complicated, and they're looking for somebody who will finally come along and give them something that's clear and simple and easy to follow. And John Calvin and his book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, he's going to fill that need, and that's why Calvinism, as harsh and oppressive and legalistic as it is going to spread like wildfire. And that brings us to our next question here. What were the French wars of religion? How did they start? How did they end? And who were the combatants? This happened in France between 1562 and 1598. It involved the Catholics and the Huguenots, and the Huguenots were French Calvinists. And it took place at all levels of French society, up from the very top ruling family down to the lowest peasant. It killed 3 million people, and France was about 10% Huguenot by the 1560s. Remember that the Huguenots are French Calvinists. Two noble families were competing for the throne of France. The Bourbon family was Huguenot, and the Guise family was Catholic and fired up by the Catholic Reformation. And they wanted to rid France of Calvinism. The ruling family was the Valois family. Now, they were Catholic, but they weren't Catholic enough to suit the Guise family. The Valois family and their top administrators and advisors, both Catholic and Huguenot, subscribed to a theory called politique, which advocated that the needs of the country, the needs of France, should come first before the needs of anyone's religious agenda. Politique was seen by those who subscribed to it as the best way to prevent carnage and bloodshed. However, people like the Guise family saw it as weakness and wishy-washiness. And the Guise family wanted to start a war which could pit French Catholics and French Huguenots against each other and hopefully conclude with their family at the throne of a religiously unified France. Well, they got the war that they wanted when they orchestrated the massacre of a Huguenot congregation in a small town named Wassy in 1562. And meanwhile, the politique Valois kings were having a lot of trouble riding out the storm and avoiding death by natural causes. 3 brothers ascended the throne and died, one up, one down, one up, one down, one up, one down, and died in somewhat quick succession as their mother, Catherine de' Medici, pulled the strings on their behalf. The politique Valois family made an attempt to end the war in the year 1572 when the Valois sister, Margaret, was set to get married to one of the top Huguenot combatants, Henry Bourbon of Navarre. And this marriage was supposed to seal a peace between the Catholics, Valois were Catholics but also politiques, and the Huguenots. And Henry of Navarre was a Huguenot but also a politique. And they did get married, but the wedding was a complete disaster because the Guise family convinced the Valois king, Charles IX, that the Huguenots were going to use the wedding to overthrow him, and he was persuaded to massacre thousands upon thousands of Huguenots throughout Paris and beyond who had come in for the wedding. Finally, the last Valois king, Henry III, made a deal with his brother-in-law now, the Bourbon Huguenot Henry of Navarre, that upon Henry III's death, that throne would pass to Henry of Navarre, and he would become Henry IV, the first Bourbon king of France. And that is exactly what happened. In the year 1589, Henry III was assassinated, and Henry of Navarre, a Bourbon, a Huguenot, a Calvinist, a Protestant, became King Henry IV of France, a 90% Catholic country. So he became king in the year 1589. But this was not an easy transition. It took Henry 4 years to establish himself as king. And the Catholics of Paris in particular refused to accept him or any Protestant king. And you can't call yourself a French king by any stretch if you don't have Paris. And we could talk about the battles and the sieges, but to make a long story much shorter, Henry IV had to convert to Catholicism. He converted from Calvinism to Catholicism in 1593, and he had to convince the Parisians, the people of Paris, that he was sincere about it before the city would capitulate and let him enter it. And that's when Henry IV said these immortal words, "Paris is well worth a mass." He was thinking specifically of Paris's willingness to accept him as the legitimate French king. Paris was the tipping point for Henry's ascension to the throne of France. Once Paris found him agreeable, other towns did too. And Pope Clement VIII even took away his previous excommunication of Henry IV. So Henry IV was officially coronated in the year 1594. And to finally bring this war to an end, Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which officially ended the wars of religion for France. So what was this Edict of Nantes? The edict specified 150 French towns in which the Huguenots could practice their religion freely without persecution. Paris was explicitly excluded from being one of those towns. You know, those Parisians. Got to keep them happy, so no Huguenots in Paris. And the Huguenots would be allowed to carry weapons, and they would be allowed to fortify those towns against attack. So what was the Catholic Reformation, also called the CounterReformation? The Catholic Reformation, or CounterReformation, was the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation. After taking a massive blow to its confidence and its credibility at the hands of Protestants, the Catholic Church rallied itself in a massive, decades-long effort to reassert its authority and its relevance. The Protestant Reformation had caused the Catholic Church clergy from the very top to question itself. But the Catholic Church eventually found its footing again and came back swinging. And Pope Paul III set the tone for this Counter-Reformation. His goals were to reconvert lost Catholics wherever he could, and to aggressively and authoritatively counter the intellectual and doctrinal arguments that Protestants made. And he identified 3 essential pathways to achieving these goals. Number 1, he said we need to decide who we are and what we stand for so that we can draw clear lines between us and them that everyone can see. Number 2, we need to tighten up church discipline with better training and education and more accountability. And number 3, we need to be ready and willing and able to go toe-to-toe with the Protestants in the arena of debate and show the world that we can effectively defend the doctrines that we believe. So the Council of Trent, all right, what did it say? The Council of Trent was an 18-year-long on and off council of church elders who defined in very specific terms all of the doctrines of the Catholic Church. And the amazing thing about the Council of Trent was that they did not compromise in the least with the Protestant Reformation. They reaffirmed all the Catholic beliefs and practices that the Protestant Reformation had declared invalid, including the necessity of good works for salvation, including all seven sacraments, including transubstantiation, including the authority of the priesthood, and extra biblical sources of truth, and elaborate ritual, and ornate structures. And they emphasized that you, the believer, need to make your choice and decide. So that brings us to exploration and conquest. And our first question is, what stimulated the Atlantic slave trade? And that was large-scale production of cash crops, especially sugar. Sugar is extremely labor-intensive and has to be processed very quickly. And this activity was going on even before America was discovered. So what countries were involved in exploration and conquest? At first it was Spain and Portugal, and then soon they had competitors like England and France and the Netherlands. And how did various countries that conducted exploration, conquest, and trade relate to each other? They were fierce competitors, even going to war with each other quite often. And then what was the Columbian Exchange and how did it affect people? This changed the trajectory of all life on this planet. It is the unintentional exchange of plants, animals, people, ideas, and diseases. And examples were corn, tobacco, draft animals, slaves, immigrants, smallpox. It completely transformed the Western Hemisphere. And it caused a major die-off of literally thousands of different species of plants and animals that has continued over the last 500 years. And new products from the New World caused an increase in slavery, caused the agricultural revolution, and the population explosion, and the enclosure movement, and the Industrial Revolution, and the list goes on. Constitutionalism. So what was the English Civil War all about, and what happened? The English Civil War was all about two things. One of these was power. Should absolute power rest with the king, or should the king have to share power with others, most notably the Parliament? It was also about religion. You had a Protestant Anglican church and a Protestant Anglican Parliament with two powerful forces pulling on these institutions from either side. It's difficult with the English Civil War to separate the religious controversy from the power controversy. But Charles I went to war with Parliament really over both. Charles I had married a French princess, the daughter of Henry IV, and a Catholic. He imposed the Anglican Common Book of Prayer on these Calvinist Scottish churches. Charles I, Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, imposed bishoprics on Calvinist Scotland, which was highly antithetical to the most basic Calvinist beliefs. You know how Calvinists are fundamentally against the idea of any kind of formal church structure or hierarchy or priesthood. So you have the Bishops' Wars, 1639 to 1640. And in these wars, Charles I attempted to impose his will on these Scottish Calvinists, also known as Presbyterians, by force. He fought two small wars against the Scottish, which he lost. To get peace, Charles I had to agree to give the Scots everything they wanted and pay for their war costs. And he signed off on this in the Treaty of Ripon in 1640. So we have war with Parliament, because in order to cover the costs of the bishops' wars, in order to pay the money he'd agreed to pay, Charles I had to call Parliament and ask them for the money. Charles I had been the one running the country without them for the last 11 years. And first, Parliament was going to insist that Charles I not raise taxes or raise armies without their consent. And this dispute resulted in the English Civil Wars between the parliamentarians, they're also called Roundheads, and the Royalists, also called Cavaliers. And this war lasted from 1642 to 1649. And that brings us to the New Model Army. The New Model Army was the name of a parliamentary army which was formed to fight Charles I in 1645 with Oliver Cromwell as second in command. And this was a highly mobile, professional army. Cromwell recruited heavily from military veterans who had Puritan beliefs like his own and radical dissenting religious views. In 1648, this New Model Army defeated Charles I's Royalist forces, and Charles I was captured. And this brings us to the execution of Charles I. The radicals that Cromwell had recruited in the New Model Army wanted Charles I executed. Parliament refused to do this, voting 125 to 58 against his execution. So, the radicals in the army that Cromwell had recruited purged the Parliament of any of the king's friends, leaving only a, quote, rump parliament, which is basically a remnant parliament. And this remnant parliament, this rump parliament, voted again, this time to execute Charles I, no problem, because all the people who were against executing him had been purged from Parliament. So Oliver Cromwell, he reconquered Ireland in the year 1649 to 1653. He was still second in command at the beginning of this campaign. And in Ireland, he massacred a Catholic garrison. He banned Catholicism in Ireland. He executed priests. He confiscated Catholic-held lands and gave them to common Protestant settlers. And in 1650, Cromwell was made commander of the New Model Army, and he continued to have it wage war in Ireland. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. A couple of different attempts at a new parliament failed. A guy named John Lambert wrote a new constitution for the country, and he called his proposed constitution the Instrument of Government in 1653. And this document gave all Christians religious freedom except the Catholics. And it named Oliver Cromwell as, quote, Lord Protector for life. In England was now known as the Protectorate. Charles II was brought in to be king soon after Cromwell died, and Cromwell's son had made a failed attempt at effectively replacing him. So who was this Oliver Cromwell? What's left to say? And what were his political beliefs, and what did he do? And I think we covered most of that, but a few markers about him is he was a Puritan, keep that in mind. He was a devout Christian. He was a staunch anti-Catholic. He was a parliamentarian. He was a military leader. He was a military dictator. And politically, he did not believe in divine right of kings. So what's an absolute monarchy and what's a constitutional monarchy? Well, an absolute monarchy is when the king has no legal obstructions to his authority. He can basically act as an unopposed dictator. And a constitutional monarchy is when the monarch's power is limited by a constitution which gives substantial power to a representative body, such as Parliament. Chapter 16, Towards a New World View. Just a few questions here. Number one, who was Copernicus? What did he do? Copernicus was a Polish astronomer and clergyman, actually, and he advanced the heliocentric theory on his deathbed in a book called The Starry Messenger. So who was Galileo and what did he do? Galileo was a scientist, instrument maker, astronomer, author. He wrote extensively about his observations of Jupiter and its moon and the moon, and he advanced the heliocentric theory, and he came up with the law of inertia, and he was forced by the church to recount of his support for Copernicus's work. So who was Isaac Newton, and what did he do? Isaac Newton was an English scientist and mathematician, and he synthesized all the ideas of all the scientists before him in the scientific revolution, and he explained them all mathematically in his book Principia. And he invented calculus, and he came up with the law of universal gravitation. Well, that was easy. Chapter 17, the era of expansion. And what was the agricultural revolution? The agricultural revolution was an explosion in the efficiency of food production, beginning in England and the Netherlands, and then spreading throughout Europe. What two developments drove it forward? These were, number one, the scientific revolution, and number two, the Columbian exchange. So what was the enclosure system? What were the results of it for rural workers? This was an English process that took many decades, and it was conducted by both large landowners and by the government. And it was generally understood that if the agricultural revolution was to reach its full potential, then communal farming was going to have to be a thing of the past. Think of your field as an experimental agricultural laboratory. A laboratory can't have people and animals traipsing through it all the time and disrupting the experiment and contaminating the results. So landowners stopped renting to tenants and started fencing off or hedging off their fields. For labor, they hired only a small amount of labor necessary to work these much more efficient fields. And the result for rural workers was they had much less work to do and much less access to the land that they had been working on for generations. So what was this industrious revolution? Well, this is the name that some historian gave to the rise in cottage industry in England and other areas that were going through the agricultural revolution and the resulting enclosure movement. And you had all of these rural agricultural workers who were now underemployed, who needed to supplement their income. You also had these urban merchants of consumer goods who had an ever-growing market due to the growing population because there was more food to eat, thanks to the agricultural revolution. Bring these two groups together and you had a marriage of rural worker and urban merchant. By using rural workers working out of their homes, urban merchants could also get around the urban trade guilds who dominated and regulated the production of all kinds of goods in the city. So what was this putting out system? And this referred to the arrangement that urban merchants had with these rural cottage industry workers. And the biggest part of these consumer goods was textiles. Rural workers had the skills to make many different consumer goods at home, especially the spinning of thread and the weaving of textiles. And the merchant could put out raw materials at the rural worker's house and then pick up the finished product later and pay the worker for their work. So, what did Adam Smith say about economics? Adam Smith studied economics and wealth and production like an organism under a microscope. And he came out against both mercantilism and trade guilds, and he was an advocate of free trade and free enterprise. He believed healthy competition and letting people do what they did best out of economic self-interest was essential to creating a productive, efficient economy that could meet many different needs as possible. Smith was an advocate of laissez-faire, which meant that the government should have a hands-off policy towards the economy. If the government interfered with the economy as little as possible, then the market would direct itself as if an invisible hand were guiding it. Smith was also an advocate of the specialization of labor and the most efficient means of industrial production, though he acknowledged that doing the exact same thing day in, day out could be demoralizing. He was also an advocate of paying workers higher wages so that they could afford to be customers of all the products that this more efficient economy could produce. Chapter 18, Life in the Era of Expansion. So what was the Consumer Revolution? The Consumer Revolution is a big change in European pattern of consumption that was closely tied to the Agricultural Revolution, the Columbian Exchange, the Atlantic economy, and slavery. And one of its main features was the sheer variety of foods and commodities that you could consume. Before this Consumer Revolution, there wasn't as much variety in what people ate. Two types of people that did tend to enjoy more variety than the rest were wealthy people and urban people. So enjoying variety reflected wealth and sophistication. New farming methods and new foods from America made this variety more accessible. And many of these commodities were not staple goods, stuff meant for everybody's consumption, but luxury items, mostly from America and cultivated with slave labor. Things like sugar and coffee and chocolate and rum and, of course, tobacco. And slavery does two things. Number one, it increases the supply of these items. And number two, it makes these items more affordable to more people. And these commodities are increasingly popular among the non-wealthy. 18th century people are not that different from 21st century people. They want to emulate the elite and feel like they are well-to-do themselves. They see the advertisements for these products on signs and in newspapers, and they want to try these things. And as a result, we see the lines between social classes starting to blur. Another aspect of the Consumer Revolution is the need for stimulants. Out on the farm, it wasn't uncommon to work the entire day, every day, slightly inebriated. But in the city, you needed a stimulus like coffee or tea to keep you awake and alert on the job. Another aspect of these commodities is they tend to be mildly to severely addictive. So that's also driving the demand for these commodities. Finally, we see people deriving their sense of identity from these products, from things that they consume. Up to this point, your identity came immediately from what you did for a living. But now, here's a new source of identity. Let me explain this way. Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd? Cowboys or Patriots? Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings? Slytherin or Gryffindor? Star Wars or Star Trek? See how we do this. We identify ourselves by the music we consume, the sports we consume, the shows we watch, and the books we read. So why did the slave trade see a steep increase during this time? Well, this is also an aspect of the Consumer Revolution. Europeans are not fully aware of the signs of slavery all around them, and they're not really thinking yet about the suffering and the cruelty that's behind the tobacco in their pipes and the coffee in their cups and the sugar in their spoons and the rum in their glasses and the cotton on their bodies. And eventually, the stories about how horrible slavery is, they're going to seep into the European consciousness, and then you're going to see some really big changes. And then this Edward Jenner. Who is he? What did he do? Well, Jenner made the most significant medical breakthrough of the 18th century, a century that didn't have many major medical breakthroughs. And he discovered that you could use cowpox, which was a relatively mild infection, to totally inoculate a person against smallpox, which was a horrific, deadly, and devastating disease. You can still find photographs on the internet of people who are suffering from smallpox, and this is before it completely disappeared off the face of the earth. And some of these faces and things are just gruesome. Well, chapter 19, we're doing this one more time. Wars and revolutions. This is the 30,000 foot level summary of the French Revolution. If you want to go deeper, you can go down to, let's say, the 10,000 foot level and see more detail by going to the unit review. And if you want to get all the way down to ground level, so you can you can really get a sense of what the French Revolution was all about, then you can review the 5 hours of French Revolution lessons 1901 through 1910 that we just did. So what type of war can we say that the 7 Years' War was? Well, we have World War I, right? The First World War. But World War I isn't really the first, because the 7 Years' War was really the first World War. And where was the 7 Years' War fought? On 4 continents, all over the world. Who was allied with whom? Britain and Prussia were allied with basically everyone else, including the newly allied France and Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Russia. So what is this concept of balance and power, and why is it important? The balance of power is a state that nations and alliances want to attain, in which no one country or alliance can dominate the others, because there's an equal and opposite power or coalitions of powers that set up to offset the first. And by establishing and maintaining a balance of power, nations can maintain peace. What was the impact of the 7 Years' War on the American Revolution? The 7 Years' War had made great territorial gains, but at great cost. The British almost doubled their national debt, and they needed to increase taxes on the American colonies in order to start paying off the war, which the colonies resented. They had made a lot of enemies during the 7 Years' War, and these enemies would be eager to help the American colonies with their revolution if it caused Britain a lot of trouble. So it says, describe the financial crisis that led to the French Revolution. And there were several reasons for this financial crisis. Number one, bad harvests had caused a food shortage and a corresponding high price for food. And number two, the cost of helping the Americans with the American Revolution had put France on the brink of bankruptcy. And number three, nobles and the clergy were exempt from any taxes, so the government had no revenue from them. And four, because of all these factors, the French government could get no more loans from its creditors. Let's define these terms. Estates. Estates are the social classes in France, and there were 3. The first estate was the French clergy. The second estate was the French nobility. The third estate was literally everyone else, including poor peasants and urban laborers, but also including the bourgeoisie, this growing class of professional, urban, educated, and often wealthy middle class. They were neither noble nor clergy. And they also wanted more representation in the governmental decision making, and they felt that they had earned it and that they deserved it. The Estates General. This is the national representative body. All 3 estates were represented in the Estates General. And even though it had not been called to meet in 175 years, it was still important to people. And delegates from this third estate actually outnumber the first and second estate delegates. But that's not going to matter, because traditionally the voting procedure was 1 estate, 1 vote, not 1 delegate, 1 vote. Well, the time for that was now over as far as the third estate was concerned. And so when the first and second estates tried to insist on doing the voting the old way, the third estate delegates refused. They refused to leave the main hall. And they finally renamed themselves the National Assembly, assuming sole legislative authority for France and taking on upon themselves the responsibilities for paying off France's debts and solving France's financial woes, and for making the necessary reforms for accomplishing this. So Louis XVI, he was the King of France. He was married to Marie Antoinette. He was an absolute monarch who had to weather France's transition into a constitutional monarchy and eventually into being a republic. For most of that time, Louis XVI pretended to be loyal to the revolution while at the same time working behind the scenes to undermine it. The National Assembly and what they did. This was the new assembly that the Third Estate was calling itself in protest of the Estates General's voting procedures. And they invite all the delegates from the other estates with the understanding that there was going to be one man, one vote. They got locked out of their meeting hall, so they walked over to a nearby tennis court. And there at this tennis court, they all of these Third Estate delegates who were now calling themselves the National Assembly, they all took an oath. And we're going to call it the tennis court oath. And they swore that they would continue to meet and that nothing would stop them until they had written a constitution for France. And this new assembly stood its ground, and over the course of a few days, members of the other two estates started coming over to the National Assembly. Louis XVI was timid and he was indecisive, and he finally gave in and ordered all three estates to meet together as the National Assembly and abide by these new voting procedures. At the same time, he was assembling a large army outside Paris, ready to attack and suppress any resistance or any insurgents. And the people of Paris started to panic, and they attacked the Bastille, the royal prison, on July 14, 1789, looking for gunpowder and weapons with which to defend themselves. And it sparks the first time that the poor and the common people of France stood up and fought for themselves and demonstrated their common commitment to the National Assembly and the revolutionary changes that were happening. And it sparked similar protests all over rural France, and that was called the Great Fear. Initially, in an effort to quell the violence of the Great Fear, the National Assembly, on August 4th, decreed the abolition of feudalism. And now they could go to work creating new legislation and writing a new constitution. The National Assembly made sweeping reforms that actually wound up hurting the economy in the short term. The price of bread went up even higher than it had been before. And as a result, thousands of women in October 1789 marched on Versailles, disrupted the National Assembly, and threatened the lives of the royal family. And their anger was quelled by an agreement that the National Assembly and the royal family would both leave Versailles forever and move permanently to Paris. The National Assembly succeeded in writing a new constitution, which King Louis XVI signed off on in July 1791 after he tried and failed to leave the country. This new constitution nationalized church property, requiring priests to take an oath of loyalty to the French nation. And they abolished inherited nobility, and they abolished trade guilds, and gave women more rights. Olympe de Gouges, what she wrote and why. She was a French writer of all kinds of things and a social reformer who wrote extensively on women's rights and on abolitionism. In response to the National Assembly's Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, she wrote Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. Later, during the Reign of Terror, she was guillotined for supposedly being a royalist and for being associated with the Girondin political club. And then finally, the Legislative Assembly was actually mandated by the National Assembly, which felt that they had done their work and that the members of the National Assembly shouldn't overstay their tenure in the French government. They said that a new Legislative Assembly should be elected and members of the National Assembly shouldn't be in it. So the National Assembly stepped down and the Legislative Assembly was elected. It was composed of younger, less experienced deputies. And one of the most powerful political clubs in this new Legislative Assembly emerged as the Jacobin Club. Meanwhile, other European countries were feeling alarmed by the king's treatment, and Prussia and Austria issued a threatening declaration to France called the Declaration of Pillnitz. The king, he looked like a traitor because of his flight, but he was kept on as king for the moment, even as France went to war with the First Coalition. And its military commander issued the Brunswick Manifesto, which explicitly threatened Paris should the royal family be harmed. And this backfired because although the Legislative Assembly was intimidated into not removing the king from power, a combination of social and political forces united in one day on August the 10th, 1792, to overthrow not only the king, but also the Legislative Assembly. And a new interim government was agreed upon to run France until a new representative body could be formed. This new body would be called the National Convention, and it would declare the Republic of France into existence on August 22nd, one day after the French army successfully stopped a Prussian invasion force at the Battle of Valmy.